Hey guys, tonight we begin with the strange world of weird medieval rules. The kind of laws that sound ridiculous today, but in the context of castles, plagues, and chronic bad hygiene actually made sense. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You roll out of bed, or rather, out of the pile of straw pretending to be a bed, and think, maybe today, I'll try to look like less of a mud-stained disaster. You eye that fancy scrap of fur you found at the market, and imagine yourself strutting into the village looking like a medieval influencer. Bad news. Congratulations. You've just broken the law. That's right. In the Middle Ages, fashion wasn't just a matter of taste. It was state policy. Enter sumptuary laws, which basically said, wear your class on your sleeve, literally. If you were a peasant, you were stuck with wool. Scratchy, dull brown wool, itchy enough to make you question the existence of God. Meanwhile, nobles swanned around in silk, so bright they looked like someone dipped them in unicorn blood. Try to imitate them, the law would notice. Authorities might fine you, humiliate you, or worse, throw you in jail. Imagine rotting in a dungeon while rats chew your shoes, all because your cloak looked too ducal for your station. Not exactly the glamorous rebellion you had in mind. And nobles didn't just ban random colors. Oh no, they were specific. Purple? Royalty only. For trims like ermine? Off limits unless you had a title longer than your family tree. Even shoes had rules. The rich wore poulaines, those ridiculous pointy shoes, so long they needed to be tied to your knees. You, as a humble dirt farmer, were expected to wear boots shaped like actual human feet. Functional, boring, very unfashionable. The logic behind all this nonsense was surprisingly practical. The rich wanted to stay visibly rich. If you looked too much like them, the entire fragile hierarchy might collapse. Imagine a noble being mistaken for a man who shovels pig manure. The horror. There was also an economic angle. Nobles didn't want peasants wasting money on silk scarves when they could be spending it on rent, taxes, and the occasional bribe to keep breathing. Looking good was basically theft of noble dignity. So you slip into your mandatory sackcloth chic and shuffle into the daylight, looking exactly as miserable as the law intended. Because in the Middle Ages, your greatest crime wasn't rebellion, heresy, or theft. It was daring to look fabulous while standing ankle-deep in mud. As the day fades, you sit by the hearth enjoying the one moment of warmth you'll all get all day when suddenly the town bell clangs. No, it's not calling you to dinner. It's the medieval version of your landlord telling you to stop having fun. The curfew bell. The word curfew comes from the French couvre-feu, literally, cover your fire. At the sound of that bell, you are expected to smother your hearth, snuff your candles, and plunge your life into darkness. Not because the authorities wanted you well rested. It was because your entire town was made of wood, straw, and pure flammability. One careless soul leaving a candle burning could turn the whole town into a blazing inferno before midnight. So the curfew rule made sense, at least in theory. In practice, it meant stumbling around your hut in total darkness, tripping over chickens, and stepping into puddles you hoped were just water. Forget reading or sewing. Unless you enjoyed stabbing yourself in the hand by candlelight, nightlife simply didn't exist. The wealthy, of course, played by different rules. Nobles had stone houses and servants to prevent accidental fires, so their hearths glowed long after the bell. You, on the other hand, were stuck with enforced bedtime, courtesy of the tower bell. Ignore it, and you could lose a week's wages in fines. But the curfew wasn't just about fire safety. Darkness kept people indoors, meaning fewer drunks, fewer thieves, and fewer midnight stabbings. Think of it as the medieval government's way of saying, we can't stop crime, but we can make sure you're too scared to cause it. So there you were, lying awake on a straw mattress, listening to rats gnaw the beams, all because someone decided the safest town was one fast asleep. Not glamorous, but the curfew bell probably saved countless lives and towns from burning to ash. Morning comes, you wake up hungry. You've been fantasizing about roasted pork all night, maybe even a slab of beef if you're lucky. You walk into the kitchen, well, the one-room hut you share with your family, and reality smacks you in the face. It's Friday, which means no meat. Again, welcome to medieval dietary law, courtesy of the church. Nearly half the calendar was off-limits for meat. Fridays, Lent, Advent, and countless feast days dedicated to saints you'd never heard of. Add it all up, and you're eating more fish than you ever wanted to see in one lifetime. Forget bacon. It's salted herring again. The spiritual message was discipline and sacrifice. The practical one? Please stop eating all the cows before winter. It sounds absurd, but it made perfect sense. Cows were precious. They plowed the fields, gave milk, and provided leather. Killing too many for short-term pleasure could spell disaster later. By enforcing meatless days, the church was, knowingly or not, managing medieval food supply chains. Fish became a holy staple, and fasting days kept livestock numbers stable enough to survive harsh winters. So, while you might curse your herring dinner, you were, in a strange way, participating in one of history's earliest sustainability programs. These rules weren't designed just to make life miserable. Many of them kept entire communities alive, from preventing famine to stopping fires to maintaining a sense of social order in a world that could easily collapse into chaos. The Middle Ages could feel like a long, hungry Lent that never truly ended. Every meal was a reminder that survival had a rule book, one written by monks, lords, and a world teetering on the edge of famine. The simplest laws, like when you could eat meat, shaped entire economies and reminded everyone that even dinner was a privilege, not a right. If everyone slaughtered their livestock, the moment hunger struck, the fields would fall silent by spring. Cows plowed the soil, chickens laid eggs, sheep gave wool. They were the machinery of survival. So, when fasting days came, you obeyed. Fish became your reluctant friend, salty and staring. These rules stretched food supplies, fed monasteries, and supported coastal villages that thrived on barrels of pickled herring. It wasn't exactly fine dining, but it was balance of faith, famine, and necessity. Still, practicality didn't make it pleasant. After 12 hours bending over fields or hauling stones, the sight of yet another slab of dried fish was enough to make your spirit sigh. The wealthy had options: almond, meat, river eels, even mock roasts shaped from lentils and spices. You had mud-flavored carp, thin soup, and imagination. Cheating was common. A chicken roasted behind shuttered windows, a rabbit stewed in secret, a wedge of contraband bacon wrapped in cloth and gilt. If caught, the punishment was public and humiliating. A fine you couldn't afford, hours standing in church as the congregation whispered about your gluttony. Yet from these restrictions, creativity bloomed. Towns built markets around salted fish. Monasteries made fortunes on preservation. Cooks experimented with grains, peas, and herbs, turning survival into slow art. The irony: a world of hunger gave birth to recipes still whispered across Europe today. But hunger has a way of testing faith. One glance at a plump rabbit darting through the hedges could undo every good intention. Its fur glistened, its steps careless, and you imagined the warmth of roasted meat after weeks of thin broth. Except that rabbit was not yours. In medieval Europe, nothing in the forest was. The trees, the deer, the birds, all belonged to the lord of the land, The forest was not a refuge, but a boundary. The noble's right to hunt was sacred, a declaration of status and control. For you, it meant turning away from abundance you could see, but never touch. To snare a rabbit without permission was poaching, a crime equated with theft, sometimes even murder. Punishment was severe, fines impossible to pay, a severed hand, or worse, execution. All for a meal that might barely fill your stomach. The irony deepened under moonlight. While peasants risked death for a single rabbit, nobles hunted for sport, killing deer by the hundreds just to display their power. The forests echoed not with birdsong, but the trumpets of huntsmen and the thud of hooves on moss. It wasn't about hunger. It was theater, a performance of dominance. And yet, even oppression found its quiet rebellion. At night, whole villages would slip into the woods together, lanterns covered, hearts pounding. The rustle of leaves became a shared secret, a net thrown, a quick strike, a silent cheer. The thrill wasn't just in the catch, it was in reclaiming, for one brief moment, a taste of freedom. Hunger was persuasive, defiance even more so. If caught, your lord's word was law, and justice bowed to no argument. In the Middle Ages, truth wasn't uncovered through logic or proof. It was surrendered to God's will. Evidence meant little when faith was the courtroom. Thus emerged the trial by ordeal, a grim ceremony where innocence was tested through fire, water, or combat, and survival itself was seen as divine judgment rather than mere luck or strength. You could be accused of stealing bread, and whether you had or not didn't matter. You'd prove your innocence by fire or water. In the ordeal by fire, you carried a red-hot iron across 3 paces, your skin blistering in the quiet of a church. Then came 3 days of waiting. If your wound healed cleanly, God had spoken, you were innocent. If it festered, you were guilty. And in a world without soap, the odds were never in your favor. Other times, it was water's turn to decide. Bound and thrown into a pond, you would either sink innocent but dead, or float, guilty and alive, just long enough to face punishment. The reasoning was simple, absurd, and absolute. Pure water rejected liars. Faith became both shield and sentence. And then there was the ordeal by combat, the loudest prayer of all. Accused and accuser faced off with weapons, trusting that divine will guided the stronger arm. But when your opponent was a trained knight, and you were a farmer with shaking hands, even your faith trembled. God, it seemed, favored those with armor. These trials were meant to reveal truth, but they revealed something deeper, the fear of chaos. People needed to believe the world had order, that even pain could hold meaning. Priests sometimes intervened quietly, interpreting the results with mercy, sparing lives when faith allowed. By the 13th century, the church itself had grown uneasy. The idea of burn him and see if he is innocent no longer aligned with divine wisdom. Slowly, these ordeals faded into history, replaced by courts, ink, and witnesses. And yet, beneath the cruelty, there was intent. Each strange law, from curfews to fasting to trials, was an attempt to hold a fragile world together. Fire, famine, and fear were constant companions. The rules didn't always make life easier, but they made survival possible. So imagine for a moment that distant world. The curfew bell long faded, the scent of smoke still lingering in the thatched air. A single candle flickers beside a bowl of fish stew, and outside, the forest hums with life forbidden to touch. Somewhere in the darkness, a bell tolls softly, not as a warning, but as a lullaby for a weary village. And as night deepens, history exhales. The strange logic of the past settles like dust, comforting in its own absurd way. The people who lived by those rules, flawed, faithful, frightened, were not so different. They were simply trying, as we all do, to find safety in a world that rarely made sense. It's early morning again, And the first sound that greets you isn't birdsong. It's the church bells. They ring not once, but again and again, as though heaven itself were impatient for you to wake up. You pull the blanket tighter around your shoulders, but the noise keeps coming, echoing through the mist. It's Sunday, and that means no work, no rest, and no escape from the sermon. You shuffle toward the chapel, half asleep, because if you don't show up, everyone will know. In a village where gossip travels faster than disease, absence is suspicious. So you go, not out of devotion, but out of survival. The bells mark the rhythm of your life, and you obey them like tides obey the moon. Inside, the church smells of wax and damp stone. The priest begins his sermon in Latin, a language as foreign to your ears as birdsong from another continent. You don't understand a word, but that's fine. You're not really here to understand. You're here to be seen, to nod at the right moments, to prove that you belong. When the Mass finally ends, you're told to rest. That's the rule. No plowing, no weaving, no fixing the roof that leaks rain into your stew. It's the Sabbath, God's day, and you are to do nothing that might resemble work. It sounds pleasant, even kind, until you realize rest can feel like another kind of labor. You sit, staring at your hands, while your mind races with all the things you could be doing. The church's intention, in its own strange way, was merciful. Rest kept people alive. It stopped men from collapsing in the fields, and gave women one day not to churn, mend, or haul. It was a primitive form of social care, enforced by faith. A single day of stillness in an otherwise endless cycle of toil. Medieval HR policy, sanctified by Scripture. But peace never lasts long. The bells ring again, not for work, but for prayer. Even idleness, you're told, can be sinful. So you trade one kind of exhaustion for another, kneeling, chanting, standing, kneeling again. You think about the fields outside, the weeds growing stronger with every passing minute, and you wonder if God minds a little hoeing after Vespers. If he doesn't, your neighbors surely will. There's always someone watching, ready to report that you were spotted mending a fence or gathering firewood. The punishment isn't severe. A fine, maybe a scolding in front of the whole congregation. But humiliation cuts deeper than any whip. You tell yourself it's not worth the risk. So you return home and spend your holy rest day doing exactly what you always do, surviving. You eat a cold meal, patch your worn clothes, and try to feel grateful for a day that feels like both mercy and imprisonment. Still, as the evening light softens and the bells finally quiet, there's a fleeting calm, a sense that maybe this strange rhythm, this enforced stillness, keeps the world from spinning off its axis. A few weeks later, you decide you've had enough of mud and monotony. Perhaps you'll learn a trade, something noble, something that might lift you above the plow. You imagine the smell of bread in a baker's shop or the glow of a forge where iron sings under the hammer. Freedom, you think, skill, dignity. Except that freedom, in medieval Europe, came with paperwork, or rather permission. You can't just decide to bake bread or hammer metal. Every craft is controlled by a guild, a kind of medieval club that guards its secrets and its profits like a dragon hoarding gold. You must become an apprentice first, serving a master for years, working from dawn to dusk for almost nothing. You sweep the floors, fetch tools, knead dough, polish armor, whatever your master commands. You learn slowly, painfully, the way generations before you learned. If you endure long enough, you graduate to journeyman, free to wander from town to town, working for wages, but still bound by guild rules. To become a master, you must craft a masterpiece, a perfect example of your work. A flawless loaf, a blade that gleams like moonlight, a tapestry so fine it seems woven from air. Then comes Judgment Day. Not divine this time, but social. The guild's masters inspect your masterpiece, their faces unreadable. Some are fair, others less so. After all, fewer masters mean less competition. Maybe they approve your work. Maybe they don't. Either way, you bow, you thank them, and you carry on. From the outside, the guild seems suffocating, walls within walls. But within those walls, there is structure, security, and community. The guild protects its members, ensures fair prices, and prevents chaos in the marketplace. No one starves because someone undercut the baker next door. Bread is bread. Armor is armor. The world, fragile as it is, keeps turning. Of course, there's always someone who breaks the rules. The man who sells cheap shoes without guild permission. The woman who brews ale on her own. For them, punishment can be swift, fines, exile, or a few missing windows, courtesy of guild enforcers. Medieval Yelp reviews weren't written in ink, but in bricks. Still, within the guild, life has its small rewards. Apprentices share stories by candlelight. Journeymen trade tricks of the craft. Masters, for all their sternness, take pride in passing on knowledge. There's comfort in belonging, even if belonging comes at a price. And through it all, the bells ring. They call you to work, to prayer, to sleep, and to wake again. Their sound marks every hour, though no one calls them hours yet. Time isn't measured by clocks, but by echoes, the toll that says the sun is high, or the fields are waiting, or God is listening. The bells never stop. They are the heartbeat of your world, the soft, unending rhythm beneath every rule and ritual. And as evening falls, their tone becomes gentler, as if the town itself is sighing into rest. You lie back, listening to the fading chime through the window. A life ruled by faith, law, and sound. The world feels heavy, yet strangely safe in its order. As the last note fades, you wonder if peace isn't found in freedom, but in rhythm, the quiet pulse that still echoes through time. The morning starts as always, not with the sun, but with the bells. Clang, clang, clang. The sound cuts through your dreams like an impatient landlord demanding rent from your sleep. You stop, mutter a few words to God, and return to work. Just as you find your rhythm again, there it is, the noon bells. Time to drop everything and enjoy your fine dining experience. A stale loaf of bread, a bruised onion, and a generous side of disappointment. A few hours later, when you think you can finally catch up on your chores, the evening bells call again. Vespers, off you go, whether you like it or not. The bells run your day like a boss who never stops emailing. But the bells weren't just about faith. They were about control. In the Middle Ages, bells ruled every aspect of life. They announced market openings, curfews, sermons, and disasters. Fire in town? Bells. Enemy attack? Bells. Someone important died? Bells again. In a sense, bells were the medieval version of push notifications. Constant, loud, and absolutely impossible to silence. The worst part? You had no say in any of it. The priest or town officials decided when the bells would ring, and you obeyed. Didn't matter if you were mid-bite, mid-prayer, or mid-nap. When the bells called, you moved. Overslept? Everyone knew, because you missed the morning bells. Left work early? Everyone knew that too, because the bells hadn't rung yet. Forgot to show up to Mass? The bells practically tattled on you. In theory, the system brought order to a world without watches or literacy. Most peasants couldn't read a calendar, let alone tell time by the sun. The bells were the village's heartbeat, structuring chaos into something predictable. But for you, it meant living like Pavlov's dog centuries before Pavlov, salivating, praying, or working on command. Your life was chopped into bell-shaped pieces of time. You didn't ask what time it was. You waited for the bells to tell you who you were supposed to be. A peasant praying, a worker sweating, a soul repenting. The bells gave your life order, yes, but also a kind of quiet imprisonment. And then there's the smell. You stink. Everyone stinks. It's not even an insult. It's just geography. Medieval Europe was an olfactory battlefield, a mix of sweat, smoke, mud, and livestock. So when you finally save enough coins to visit the local bathhouse, it feels like a small miracle. You imagine steam, clean skin, maybe even a hint of lavender soap. But when you arrive, the doors are barred shut. The authorities have decided bathhouses are basically plague factories. And, to be fair, they're not entirely wrong. Bathhouses weren't just for bathing. They were the social media of the Middle Ages, equal parts gossip parlor, dating pool, and bargain brothel. You could soak, chat, flirt, and catch a disease all in the same hour. When syphilis and plague began sweeping through Europe, bathhouses became everyone's favorite scapegoat. Close them down, the logic went, and maybe people would stop dying. Or at least they'd die cleaner. Either way, fewer public baths meant fewer sinners stewing together in hot water, and far more peasants stewing in their own filth at home. Home bathing, of course, was an ordeal. You hauled freezing buckets from the well, dumped them into a wooden tub, and tried to convince yourself this counted as self-care. Soap was a luxury. Hot water was rarer than mercy. And firewood? Your family would rather use that to cook dinner than to keep you smelling less like despair. Nobles, of course, didn't share your misery. They had private baths, perfumed oils, and servants to scrub them clean. You, on the other hand, were left rubbing yourself with a damp rag and pretending that your natural musk was a fashion statement. Even when bathhouses were open, the church viewed them with suspicion. Too much nudity, too much laughter, too much pleasure. Clearly the work of the devil. If you enjoyed yourself, it was probably sinful. Bathhouses were tolerated 1 year, banned the next, depending on which bishop had the loudest opinion. You never knew if your next bath would leave you refreshed or excommunicated. So you shuffle home, dirt still under your nails, hair greasy, and skin itchy. You tell yourself it's fine. Everyone smells. And that's true. Everyone does smell. Sweat, hay, livestock, and failure. But deep down, you know people notice. The world around you may be filthy, but judgment travels faster than soap. Still, even stinking peasants dream. After months of labor and cabbage soup, you finally save a few coins. You think, maybe I'll buy something nice. A good tunic. Some shoes that don't leak. But then you remember, you're not allowed to. Welcome to the world of sumptuary laws, medieval society's way of keeping you in your place. These laws dictated what you could wear, eat, or own based on your social class. Velvet, silk, and fur, reserved for nobles. Purple? That's practically a royal trademark, off limits to anyone below a duke. Even jewelry, buttons, and embroidery could get you fined if they looked too fancy. Let's say you're a successful merchant who's done well trading wool. You've earned enough to buy a velvet tunic. Too bad. Velvet is for the upper class only. Want to wear a hat with gold thread? Forget it. That's an instant offense. The law saw your prosperity not as success, but as arrogance, a peasant pretending to be a lord. Guilds and lords enforced these laws with iron precision. Dress above your rank, and punishment followed. Fines, public shame, even exile. The message was unmistakable. Work as hard as you like, but you'll die in the station where you were born. Society believed every role, from king to cobbler, was ordained by God, and dressing too fine risked defying divine order. Nobles insisted these laws upheld virtue and modesty, but their true purpose was control. They guarded the fragile illusion that status was sacred and unchangeable. A peasant draped in silk wasn't just well-dressed. They were dangerous, a living challenge to the order that kept the powerful on their thrones. So you kept your rough wool and humble life, walking past nobles glittering in gold, breathing perfume while you breathed smoke. The bells still ruled your hours. The laws still ruled your identity. A life measured in obedience, not ambition. You cough once in the marketplace. Bad move. Instantly, heads turn, eyes narrow, and someone quietly backs away like you just turned into death's favorite intern. Welcome to plague season, a time when a sneeze could shut down an entire street and fear itself became law. In the Middle Ages, quarantine wasn't optional. If someone in your home got sick, officials would seal your door shut and paint a cross on it, warning others that death was making a house call. You stayed inside until everyone was either cured or carried out. Fresh air? A luxury for the healthy? Compassion? A liability. No one wanted to risk their family for yours. It sounds cruel, and it was, but in a world where science hadn't yet explained disease, this was the only form of public health available. People didn't understand bacteria or viruses. They understood contagion through superstition. Bad air, sin, divine punishment. The church prescribed prayers, and physicians prescribed leeches. Both were equally ineffective. So isolation became the only tool left, and in a strange way, it worked. Not perfectly, but well enough to slow the inevitable. Entire towns built quarantine zones, often on the outskirts. Crude huts filled with the sick, tended by desperate clerics or condemned criminals. The lazarettos, as they were called, became Europe's first hospitals, if you could call them that. The smell alone could make a healthy man reconsider his faith. Still, the plague wasn't the only thing shaping daily fear. Even after the worst waves passed, the world was haunted by its memory. A simple cough, a rash, or a rumor could spark panic. Families turned on each other. Neighbors locked doors. And whole markets shut down because one merchant looked a little too pale. Fear was contagious long after the disease itself faded. And the rules multiplied. No bathing during outbreaks, because people thought warm water opened your pores to evil air. No gatherings, no fairs, no theater. If you died, your possessions were burned, your house purified with smoke and vinegar. Cities appointed searchers of the dead, whose job was to examine corpses and record causes of death. Imagine being paid to poke potentially plague-ridden bodies with a stick. If you survived, you didn't come out unchanged. The survivors lived in a world where cleanliness, diet, and even fashion became tied to health and morality. Luxury was sin. Poverty was punishment. Illness meant guilt. So people clung tighter to their rules, believing obedience could keep chaos away. Take food, for instance. Eating was no longer just survival. It was status, morality, and law, all baked into one stale loaf. Nobles feasted on venison, pheasant, and white bread made from the finest flour. The poor gnawed on dark barley loaves dense enough to double as bricks. The difference wasn't taste. It was hierarchy. White bread was purity, refinement, divine favor. Brown bread was your place in the order of things. And heaven help you if you tried to eat above your station. Buying a goose, sneaking venison into your pot, or even baking fine bread could get you fined or publicly shamed. The reasoning was simple. Limited resources must feed those deemed most important. If every farmer roasted swans on Sunday, the Duke's table might go empty, and that, apparently, was unthinkable. But beneath the cruelty, these food laws also had a logic. They rationed scarce supplies and prevented shortages. In a fragile ecosystem where one bad harvest could spark famine, order mattered more than fairness. So while you stared longingly at the nobles' golden platters, you also knew, somewhere deep down, that their feasts were the price of your survival. And yet, class distinction didn't stop at the dinner table. It followed you into every aspect of life, even your wardrobe. The sumptuary laws turned clothing into a visual hierarchy. Nobles in velvet and fur, merchants in dyed wool, peasants in coarse beige. Wear silk without permission, and you could be fined, mocked, or worse. Inspectors patrolled towns checking hems and fabrics, making sure no one looked too rich for their bloodline. It sounds absurd now. Fashion police with real authority, but it mattered deeply then. Clothes weren't just fabric. They were identity, obedience made visible. A well-dressed peasant was a threat, not because of vanity, but because appearance challenged the illusion that class was destiny. Nobles insisted these laws preserved virtue, but they were really defending the scaffolding of power. So, while lords paraded in embroidered robes so heavy they needed servants to carry their sleeves, you kept your tunic plain, your belt cheap, your head bowed. Even your smell marked your station. Bathhouses, once the medieval equivalent of spas, had been closed or condemned. Authorities feared they spread plague, and the church saw them as sinful dens of temptation. The result? An entire continent that collectively stank of sweat, smoke, and resignation. You could, of course, wash at home, if you had the time, water, or firewood. But soap was expensive. Hot baths were luxuries, and most peasants decided hygiene wasn't worth freezing to death. So you embraced the scent of survival and called it natural musk. Nobles, meanwhile, bathed in perfumed oils and blamed your odor for the world's corruption. And over it all, through every hour of work, prayer, and exhaustion, the bells kept ringing. They marked your days, when to wake, when to eat, when to rest, when to confess. They were both your clock and your cage. You didn't ask what time it was. You waited for the bells to tell you who you were supposed to be. As the evening chime echoes across the rooftops, you pause in the fading light. The air smells faintly of rain and wood smoke, of bread baking somewhere richer than you'll ever be. You wipe your hands, stretch your sore back, and listen. The sound rolls over the fields, familiar, relentless, eternal. Within the sound of the bells lies the rhythm of your world, law, fear, and routine woven into one. The same rules that confine you also protect you. You know your place, your purpose, your limits. Harsh, yes, but steady. As the bells fade, they soften into a lullaby, a reminder that even in its absurdity, the medieval world found comfort in order, a fragile peace born not from freedom, but from the safety of knowing what never changes. The rule was simple. Better one dead family than a dead village. Comforting, right? When plague season struck, compassion was a luxury no one could afford. Markets shut down, inns closed, weddings and fairs vanished. Anything that made life even slightly less miserable was outlawed. The logic, at least on parchment, made sense. Keep people apart, and maybe death would stop spreading like free samples at a fair. For you, it meant something else entirely. Hunger, silence, and too much time with your family in one cramped, unventilated room. Days blurred together, marked only by coughs and prayers. If someone inside fell sick, the local authorities would lock your door from the outside and nail a painted cross to it, a warning to the rest of the town that everyone within was as good as gone. You didn't leave until you were either cured or buried. If you happened to be a gravedigger, life got even worse. There was no escaping your duty. You were forced to haul corpses, dig trenches, and shovel dirt from dawn to dusk, all while trying not to catch the very thing you were burying. Refuse the job, and you'd be punished like a criminal. Accept it, and you'd probably die anyway. Travel bans made everything worse. Entire towns locked their gates. Strangers were greeted not with hospitality, but with suspicion, or, more often, with pitchforks. Merchants were turned away, pilgrims were stranded, and tourism became a word no one dared to speak. The world had shrunk to the size of whatever walls surrounded you. Still, not every rule was folly. Some cities, through strict quarantines, actually reduced the death toll. Others simply panicked, boarded up the streets, and hoped God was paying attention. Either way, the result was the same. You, trapped at home, rationing stale bread, and praying your neighbor's cough didn't drift through the walls. You'd sit by the window, staring at the lifeless streets, wondering who would be the next to vanish. The only upside? For once, you didn't have to attend church. But that small mercy faded when the priest arrived anyway, not to bless your house, but to mark your door like it was the medieval version of a biohazard sticker. In the Middle Ages, breaking quarantine wasn't rebellion. It was suicide, and worse, it was treason against your village. Fear made everyone an enforcer. If you tried to slip out, your neighbors might make sure you stayed inside permanently. When the end came, it wasn't peaceful. You'd think death would mean freedom from rules, but even the grave had regulations. Burial was a luxury, and like all luxuries, it had a price. First problem: consecrated ground. If you wanted a proper churchyard burial, you needed money. Fees for the grave, fees for the priest, even fees for candles to burn over your body. Die poor, and your corpse might be dumped in a mass grave outside the city walls, sharing space with refuse and rats. You'd rest among the stench of rotting cabbage and old bones, not in sacred soil, but in a trench barely deep enough to hide you. Second problem: space. Cemeteries filled up fast. When they ran out of room, gravediggers didn't expand, they recycled. After a few years, your bones might be exhumed and tossed into a charnel pit to make room for someone newer, richer, or holier. Rest in peace? Not likely. Even in death, you could be evicted. Third problem: how you died. Take your own life? Forget the churchyard. Die a criminal? Your body could end up hanging from the gallows or buried at a crossroads to keep your restless soul from haunting decent folk. Die of plague? Straight into the nearest pit, covered in quicklime. No ceremony, no prayer, no dignity. And if you'd been excommunicated, things were worse still. The church wouldn't even let your body near holy ground. Eternal damnation wasn't punishment enough. They wanted you banned from the graveyard, too. The wealthy, of course, had their own rules. Nobles rested in carved stone tombs, their marble faces gazing down on generations of peasants. They had priests, choirs, and monuments built in their honor, the medieval version of eternal branding. Meanwhile, your grave marker, if you were lucky enough to have one, was a rough stone scratched with, "Here lies nobody important." Even in death, hierarchy endured. The rules didn't just dictate how you lived, they told you how to rot. But perhaps the cruelest irony was that, centuries later, no one would even remember your name. Your descendants might walk the same streets, unaware they were treading over your forgotten bones. In medieval Europe, even the afterlife had a waiting list. Now imagine you somehow survived long enough to sit in a tavern, a few mugs of ale deep, laughing with your friends. One of them mutters that the bishop's new hat looks like a stolen beehive. You laugh too loud. Bad idea. In the Middle Ages, mocking the church wasn't a joke. It was a crime. The church wasn't merely a place of worship. It was an empire. It owned more land than kings, collected more taxes than nobles, and wielded more power than any army. It was the medieval equivalent of Amazon, the IRS, and your landlord, all rolled into one. Insulting a priest, questioning doctrine, or even laughing at a sermon could get you punished. Sometimes you'd pay a fine. Sometimes you'd be forced to do public penance, standing barefoot in church while everyone stared, whispering prayers and judgment. Push further, and you might be branded a heretic. And once that label stuck, your fate was sealed. Heresy and fire went hand in hand. Because for all their piety, medieval authorities believed fear was the surest path to faith. The rules, they said, were for your salvation. But everyone knew the truth. They weren't protecting your soul. They were protecting power. In the end, that's what all these laws about clothes, food, plague, and prayer had in common. They created order from fear, hierarchy from chaos. They made sure everyone knew their place, both in life and beyond it. And as the church bells toll through the night, echoing over locked gates and shallow graves, one thought lingers. In this world, peace was never freedom. It was obedience, and it was the only thing that kept the living from joining the dead. The church's authority in the Middle Ages depended on one thing above all else: fear. Not the trembling, superstitious kind, but the quiet, obedient fear that kept people from questioning power. If a peasant could mock a priest without punishment, if a farmer could laugh at a bishop's greed and live to tell it, the whole system might start to wobble. And the medieval church did not tolerate wobbling, so you kept your jokes to yourself. Maybe after dark, in the barn, when you were sure no one was listening, you whispered something daring. A muttered line about the bishop's hat looking like an upside-down beehive, or about how God must have a strange sense of humor to let priests eat better than kings. But even then, you looked over your shoulder, because someone was always listening. Neighbors tattled, not out of malice, but survival. Reporting blasphemy could earn favor with the clergy, or reduce one's own penance. And really, who wouldn't trade your secret for a few fewer lashes? The church had turned confession into currency, and fear into law. Meanwhile, the clergy themselves were far from saintly. Some lived in indulgent luxury, dining on roasted swan, wearing rings heavy with gold, and keeping housekeepers who were more mistress than maid, yet criticizing that hypocrisy was off limits. You smiled, nodded, and pretended that the bishop as 15-course feast was spiritually enlightening, while you gnawed on bread so hard it could break a tooth. So you bit your tongue, laughed politely at sermons, and never, ever made jokes about priests again. Because in the Middle Ages, words could kill you faster than swords. Free speech didn't exist, and the church had plenty of creative ways to remind you of that. Here, sticks and stones might break your bones, but words could definitely get you burned. Night falls. You're finally home after another day of bending your back for someone else's wealth. Your body aches. You sit by the hearth, eating watery stew and trying to thaw your fingers. For a brief moment, you feel almost human again. Then, the church bell clangs. The message is clear. Cover your fire. Snuff your candles. Fun time's over. This wasn't a friendly suggestion. It was law. Every night, hearth fires had to be covered or extinguished before sleep. Ignore it, and you risked fines, punishment, or worse, burning your whole village to the ground. In towns built of dry wood, straw roofs, and bad decisions, one sleepy farmer could start a blaze that devoured everything, so you obey. You shovel dirt over your fire, muttering curses, and sit in the dark. Your home grows cold almost instantly. The only sounds are the scurrying of rats in the rafters and the muffled sighs of your family. Entertainment is limited. Talk to people you've already had too much of. Listen to the wind, or imagine how warm the nobles must be in their stone halls, where fires burned all night long. Because, of course, the rich didn't follow this rule. Lords, bishops, and merchants with stone manners didn't worry about flames. They had servants to tend their fires, guards to patrol their halls, and thick walls that wouldn't ignite from a single spark. The law wasn't for them. It was for you, the peasant living in a wooden tinderbox, the weakest link in a flammable chain. The rule worked. Villages burned less often, but it made nights miserable. Darkness wasn't peaceful. It was terrifying. Thieves, wolves, and drunks roamed freely. The fire had been your only protection, your only light. Without it, you sat shivering in the black, listening to the silence, hoping nothing outside decided you looked edible. Still, you followed the rule. Because in the medieval world, survival wasn't about comfort. It was about obedience. Every law, every curfew, every sermon whispered the same message: suffer now, stay safe later. And if that meant freezing in the dark, so your village didn't earn, then so be it. You'd done your duty, yet even obedience had limits. Far to the north, among the Vikings, defiance was its own kind of law, one that came with blood, exile, or both. Take the story of Eric the Red. Born in Norway and raised in Iceland, he was the kind of man who treated feuds like pastimes. After a series of violent disputes, one involving murder over a set of borrowed beams, Eric found himself outlawed. That meant more than exile. It meant erasure. You lost your rights, your property, and your protection. Anyone could kill you, and no one would avenge you. So, with nothing left, Eric looked westward. He heard whispers from sailors of a distant land glimpsed through fog, a place beyond the edge of the known world. With a few loyal followers, he set sail, chasing exile into legend. When his ship finally cut through the mist and reached Greenland's frozen coast, the sight must have felt like punishment from the gods. Jagged glaciers towered over desolate valleys. The soil was thin and stingy. The wind cut like a blade. But Eric saw opportunity, or at least he pretended to. If he couldn't change his fate, he could rename it. So he called the place Greenland, hoping the optimistic name would lure settlers. It was perhaps history's first great marketing lie. People came, desperate farmers, dreamers, and outcasts, and together they carved a fragile colony from the ice. Even there, the old world followed. The church arrived soon after, planting crosses in the tundra and laws in the hearts of men. Faith was the one export Europe never ran out of. And once again, survival came down to the same bargain. Obey, endure, and hope heaven was warmer than Greenland. Back in Europe, life went on under the same rhythm, bells, rules, and obedience. You woke when told, worked when told, prayed when told, and slept in the dark because someone else said it was safer that way. The church ruled not only your soul, but your schedule. And defiance wasn't bravery. It was suicide. So you did what every faithful peasant was expected to do. Bowed your head, smothered your fire, and silenced your thoughts. Doubt was a luxury you couldn't afford, so you shared it only with the dark, hoping the night would guard your secrets better than any priest ever could. Winter bit hard, even in summer. The air cut like a blade, and even the soil thin, rocky, unyielding seemed to reject the idea of human survival. To most, this was no place for farming, no land for raising families. But Eric the Red wasn't like most men. He was more than a warrior. He was a salesman, a visionary, and above all, a master of illusion. After being exiled from Iceland for killing a few too many neighbors during a blood feud, Eric found himself wandering westward, chasing half-whispered tales of a distant shore glimpsed by sailors blown off course. When his ship finally broke through the fog and reached the coast of this new land, it must have looked more punishment than promise. A frozen wasteland wrapped in wind and silence. The mountains were jagged, the fjords choked with ice, and the valleys bare. Yet standing on that brutal shore, Eric saw not what it was, but what it could be, or rather, what he could make others believe it was. He named it Greenland. The name was a masterpiece of deception, a promise painted over ice. In a world where words could shape destiny, Eric's lie gleamed brighter than truth itself, bold enough to lure dreamers across the sea, brilliant enough to make a wasteland sound like paradise. Back in Iceland, Eric the Red began to weave his greatest tale. He spoke of fertile meadows where sheep could graze, of wide valleys rich with soil, of fjords teeming with fish. He told of a land waiting to be tamed, a place where a man could build a farm without paying tribute to any lord. Every word was bait for dreamers and desperate families alike. Iceland, after all, was growing crowded. Land was scarce, feuds endless, and opportunities limited. Greenland, Eric promised, was freedom wrapped in green hills and clear water. The truth was ice and rock, but the dream was irresistible. By 985 CE, Eric had gathered a fleet of longships, around 25, according to the sagas. They carried everything a new world would need: cattle, sheep, goats, iron tools, barrels of grain, timber, and families willing to risk everything for the faint hope of prosperity. Some came chasing land, others escaping debts or disputes. All were bound together by faith in one man's story. The journey was no gentle voyage. The North Atlantic was a merciless teacher, and the Vikings knew its lessons by heart. Fog thick as wool swallowed the horizon. Icebergs lurked beneath the surface, waiting to rip open wooden hulls like paper. Sudden storms struck without warning, snapping masts and sweeping men overboard. The cold bit through furs and soaked wool until even the strongest grew numb. On deck, the livestock bellowed and slipped in their pens, while children cried into their mothers' arms. Meals were hard bread, dried fish, and whatever could be boiled in salt water. Sleep came in snatches, between prayers muttered to the old gods or the new. Every creak of timber could mean disaster. And still they pressed on. Turning back meant shame. Continuing meant danger, but also the chance to claim a place in legend. Of the 25 ships that left Iceland, barely 14 made it to Greenland. The rest were lost to storms, crushed by ice, or forced to limp home, shattered. Yet those who survived staggered ashore on Greenland's rocky coast with a fierce, exhausted joy. They had crossed the cruelest waters in the world and lived. But survival was only the beginning. What they found was not a green paradise, but a land of extremes. Summers were brief, barely enough to grow hay for the animals. Winters were long and merciless, the sun vanishing for weeks behind walls of snow. Even so, the settlers built. They raised turf houses with thick walls to trap heat, roofed them with sod, and dug storage pits to keep food from freezing solid. Herds of sheep and cattle grazed what little grass there was. Every day became a test of endurance. Yet, through sheer stubbornness, the Norse colony took root. They founded 2 main settlements, the eastern and western settlements, hugging the southern fjords where the climate was slightly kinder. Small farms dotted the valleys, and wooden churches soon rose beside them, humble but defiant. Trade ships occasionally arrived from Iceland and Norway, bringing iron, timber, and news from the world they'd left behind. In return, the settlers sent back walrus ivory, sealskins, and even polar bear pelts, luxury goods in European markets. For a while, it worked. Eric himself became the colony's patriarch, his fame transforming him from exile to legend. His red hair and fiery temper were said to match his courage. His farm at Brattalaye became the heart of Greenland's fragile society, a symbol of what sheer willpower could build on the edge of the world. His wife, Jodhild, even built the first church in Greenland, though Eric reportedly refused to set foot in it, a Viking to the end. But beneath the triumph, cracks began to show. The growing seasons shortened as the climate cooled. Sea routes became choked with ice. The settlers' cattle weakened, and hay ran out before winter's end. Trade with Europe faltered. Some years, no ships came at all. Isolation grew thicker than the snow. Still, they clung to the illusion that Greenland was what Eric had promised, a land of hope, not hardship. The lie that built the colony had become its lifeline. By the time Eric's descendants ruled his old farm, the world had changed. Iceland thrived, Norway consolidated power, and Greenland faded into myth. Yet for nearly 5 centuries, those settlers endured, carving out existence where none should have been possible. When later explorers stumbled upon the ruins of their turf homes and empty churches, they found no sign of conquest, just quiet abandonment, as if the colony had simply sighed and vanished into the ice. Eric the Red's legacy, then, wasn't the land he claimed, but the idea he sold. He proved that stories, even lies, could move nations, launch ships, and build worlds on nothing but belief. And in that sense, Greenland was green, not with grass, but with the color of hope. Because sometimes, in history as in life, Survival begins with the courage to believe in a better world, even if you have to invent it first. There were no forests to fell, no golden fields waiting for plows, and no soft pastures rolling under the sun. The land was stone and wind, beautiful but merciless. The mountains stood bare, the valleys pinched and narrow, and the soil was thin, reluctant to yield anything. Yet for the Viking settlers who followed Eric the Red across the sea, surrender was not an option. If Greenland refused to welcome them, they would carve their welcome into its frozen skin. Their answer was simple, brilliant, and utterly practical: turf houses. Strips of sod, thick and damp with roots, were cut from the ground, stacked like bricks, and pressed tight until they formed walls several feet thick. These heavy, green walls held heat like a fist. Against the howling winds that rolled down from the glaciers, they were as close to armor as a house could get. Driftwood, washed ashore after years adrift on the ocean, became treasure, shaped into beams, doorframes, and supports. Every splinter of timber was scavenged, reused, and revered. Inside, the air was smoky and dim. The only light came through tiny slits covered with animal skins, and fires burned low in stone hearths, filling the space with warmth and choking fumes. Yet compared to the cold outside, these homes were sanctuaries. Families slept side by side on wooden benches padded with furs, sharing body heat through the endless nights. The smell of peat smoke, drying fish, and livestock lingered in every breath. But those scents meant survival. Slowly, the settlement grew. Each family claimed a patch of land, carving out a farmstead from frost and stone. Barns and byres were built into the hills, half underground, to trap warmth and shield the animals from blizzards. Goats, sheep, and cattle became lifelines. During summer, they grazed on the tough grasses that clung to the narrow valleys. During winter, they huddled inside, their breath adding a ghostly mist to the air. Fences were woven from driftwood or stones pulled from frozen soil. Women spun wool into thread, wove cloth, churned butter, and tended to children, while men hunted seals, caribou, and the occasional polar bear to fill the stores for winter. The Greenlanders quickly learned that the land itself was their greatest enemy and their only ally. Survival was a group effort. Neighbors shared tools, helped raise roofs, and mended fences together. In a world this harsh, isolation was death. At night, they gathered around the hearth, trading stories of Iceland, Norway, and the old gods, tales of Odin and Thor lingering like embers of a fading world. Some settlers built small wooden crosses above their doorways, blending pagan resilience with Christian hope. What they built from turf and driftwood wasn't just shelter. It was defiance. Proof that human hands could turn even a frozen shore into a home. To a Viking farmer, soil was sacred, the true measure of wealth. But Greenland's soil was stingy, barely deep enough to plant a root. Farming here was not like the green valleys of Iceland or Norway. Summers were short, and winters seemed endless. Grass barely had time to grow before frost returned. Yet the settlers persisted. Sheep and goats became the backbone of their economy, hardy enough to survive the thin pastures. They gave milk, wool, and eventually meat. Cattle were a luxury. They symbolized status, but keeping them alive through winter was a costly gamble. Storing hay became an obsession. Every blade of grass mattered. During the brief summer, families worked from dawn to dusk, cutting and drying hay, stacking it in barns for the long darkness ahead. A shortage of hay meant death, not just for the livestock, but for the people who depended on them. Crops were a constant struggle. Barley and rye were planted in small, sheltered plots, but the yields were pitiful. Grain was too precious to waste. Instead, the settlers relied on dairy, butter, cheese, and curds that could be stored or traded. They fished the fjords, hunted seals for meat and oil, and risked long expeditions across treacherous ice for walrus tusks, a valuable trade good in Europe. Even children had roles: herding sheep, gathering eggs, collecting driftwood, or tending tiny gardens of herbs. It was a fragile existence. A single bad harvest, an early frost, or an outbreak of disease among the animals could unravel everything. Archaeological evidence from Greenland settlements reveals bones of dogs and even newborn calves butchered in famine years, signs of desperation. When food ran out, families slaughtered what they could, stretching every resource just to see spring again. But even in hardship, the settlers held fast to their traditions. Farming was not just survival, it was identity. The Norse saw themselves as free farmers, masters of their own land. To abandon that, even at the edge of the known world, was to lose what made them who they were. Their routines never changed: milking at dawn, hay cutting in summer, slaughtering livestock in autumn, storing for the long dark. These rhythms gave meaning to their struggle, a heartbeat. Against the silence of the ice. Greenland tested every part of them: their bodies, their faith, their endurance. Yet for more than 4 centuries, the Norse held on. They built churches beside their turf homes, baptized their children, and buried their dead beneath stone cairns overlooking the fjords. They traded with Europe when ships came, and when they didn't, they endured alone. In time, their settlements would fade, swallowed by cold and isolation. But for those first generations, survival itself was triumph. Their turf houses, half buried in the earth, still stand as echoes of that defiance, reminders that even in a land of ice and silence, the will to live could shape a world. In the end, the Vikings of Greenland proved a simple truth: civilization is not built on comfort, but endurance. Against unrelenting wind, frost, and darkness, they forged something far greater than ease or beauty. They built permanence, a fragile defiance carved into ice and stone. Not paradise, but belonging. Not abundance, but survival. And in that quiet persistence, they found the closest thing to home. For Viking children in Greenland, life began in the shadows of turf houses and under the watchful eyes of a community fighting for every breath of survival. Unlike the bustling markets of Norway or the green farms of Iceland, childhood here was not defined by laughter or leisure. It was a brief apprenticeship in endurance. Children learned early that to live in Greenland was to labor, to work, to obey, and to prepare for a world where death hovered close at hand. From the moment they could walk, the young were folded into the rhythm of survival. The smallest carried water, gathered dung for fuel, or helped watch over sheep grazing in the narrow valleys. Slightly older children tended goats, milked cows, or combed the shoreline for driftwood, a precious resource in a land without trees. The girls, under the stern yet patient gaze of their mothers, learned to spin wool and weave, mastering the slow, repetitive labor that would one day keep their families clothed. The boys followed their fathers into the hills and fjords, watching how to hunt seals, cast nets for fish, or carve tools from bone. Childhood was an education not in books, but in necessity. Mistakes were costly. A misstep could mean lost food, broken tools, or worse. Yet within that harsh education, there were moments of joy. Archaeologists have unearthed small carved toys, miniature horses, boats, and figures fashioned from bone and wood. These fragile traces reveal that even amid struggle, parents carved out space for laughter. A child's giggle might echo across the cold air, a rare sound of innocence in a world built on endurance. The fjords themselves became playgrounds. Children skipped stones across icy waters, raced to climb rocky slopes, or invented games with bones and sticks. But play was always shadowed by duty. Childhood in Greenland was brief. Adulthood came early. There were no schools, no letters, No written lessons, only the spoken word. Knowledge passed from tongue to ear, from elder to child. Around the hearth at night, as smoke curled through the dim rooms, stories filled the silence. The old sagas told of Odin the All-Seeing, Thor the Thunderer, and the voyages of legendary ancestors who had crossed seas and slain giants. These stories were not idle diversions. They were lessons in courage, cunning, and endurance. They taught children what it meant to be strong, to face hardship without fear, to keep faith even in desolation. When Christianity later took root among the settlers, children learned Latin prayers alongside the old tales, though few could read or write. Memory was their library, and storytelling their textbook, but danger was a constant companion. Illness spread easily through the close, smoky turf houses. Winters were long and brutal, and famine sometimes claimed the youngest first. Archaeological excavations have revealed tiny graves near the settlements, infants, toddlers, and children scarcely old enough to speak. Their short lives stand as quiet testimonies to the fragility of existence in Greenland. Yet families kept having children. Love played its part, but survival demanded it. More children meant more hands for work, more strength for the household, and a greater chance to endure. A child's laughter could pierce the monotony of hardship. But behind every smile lay the sobering truth. These children were being shaped for a lifetime of struggle. From birth, they inherited the resilience their parents had carried across the sea, a resilience that sustained the settlement for generations. In Greenland's Viking colonies, survival was not only a matter of what men could hunt or plow. It rested equally in the invisible labor of women. Inside the dim turf houses, women's work was the thread holding every family together. Without it, the colony would have fallen within a generation. Weaving lay at the heart of this quiet endurance. From sheep and goat wool, women carded, spun, and wove cloth on tall upright looms that stood in the smoky corners of their homes. This cloth was more than clothing. It was currency. Woven wool, known as vadmal, became one of Greenland's most valuable exports, traded across the North Atlantic. A woman's skill at the loom was therefore both domestic craft and economic power. Each hour she bent over her work added to the prosperity of her household and the survival of the colony itself. But weaving was only one thread in a web of labor. Women also managed the dairy, milking cows and goats, making butter, cheese, and skyr, a sour milk curd that sustained families through the long winters. A single spoiled batch could mean hunger months later. They tended the hearth, cooking meals from scarce supplies, dried fish, seal meat, grains imported from Norway. Firewood was precious, and keeping the fire alive through endless nights required vigilance. One mistake could leave a family cold, hungry, and desperate. Childbearing brought its own perils. With limited medical knowledge and harsh living conditions, childbirth was often deadly. Many women died young, leaving behind children to be raised by grandmothers or older daughters. Those who survived balanced infants strapped to their backs while spinning wool or tending livestock, their lives a continuous negotiation between care and toil. Children were often raised communally. Older daughters helped nurse their younger siblings, while boys fetched water or guarded the animals. In this way, women's labor extended beyond their own households, binding the entire community in a shared effort to endure. Women were not only laborers, they were keepers of memory. When the fires burned low, they recited sagas, prayers, and ancestral tales, ensuring that their children grew up knowing the lineage of their people. As Christianity spread through the colony, it was often women who kept the faith alive. They taught children their first prayers, organized family rituals for feast days, and integrated new beliefs into the rhythms of Old Norse traditions. In this way, women became both spiritual anchors and cultural preservers. Though their names rarely appear in sagas, they were the colony's backbone. Their weaving clothed the settlers. Their dairy filled the larders. Their hands built and sustained the walls that kept out the cold. In the silence and smoke of their turf homes, they forged the fabric of life itself, proving that survival in Greenland was as much a woman's triumph as a man's. Even at the edge of the known world, faith traveled with them. When Eric the Red's people first set foot in Greenland, most still clung to the old gods, Odin, Thor, and Freya. Sacrifices and charms bound them to a spiritual realm that had guided their ancestors for centuries. Yet as decades passed, Christianity swept across Scandinavia and reached even this frozen outpost. A transformation was profound, reshaping beliefs, rituals, and the settlers' understanding of destiny itself. The old gods gave way to the cross, but the spirit of endurance remained. Whether they prayed to Thor or Christ, the people of Greenland faced the same relentless challenges: wind, frost, darkness, and hunger. They carved life from a land that offered almost nothing, holding fast through faith and labor alike. Childhood, womanhood, work, and worship were all woven into one unbroken struggle to endure. From that struggle, they forged something that outlasted comfort, a civilization defined not by ease or wealth, but by the sheer will to survive. Eric the Red himself resisted conversion, fiercely loyal to the gods of his youth. He saw the new faith as weakness, an insult to the hard, proud spirit that had carried his people across oceans. Yet his wife, Theodald, embraced Christianity with fervor. Against her husband's protests, she built a small church near their farm at Brattahlid. The sagas say that Eric refused ever to enter it, scorning the new religion. Still, Theodald's chapel stood, the first Christian church in Greenland, a humble turf-walled structure that became the seed of a new faith on the island's rocky soil. From that modest beginning, Christianity spread. By the early 12th century, Greenland had its own bishops, priests, and even stone churches, the most famous being the great cathedral at Gardar. Its ruins still stand today, thick stone walls. Rising above the grass, silent witnesses to faith in a land where mere survival was a victory. Religion brought more than ritual. It connected Greenland to the wider world. Bishops in Norway sent priests. Greenlanders sent back walrus ivory, furs, and hides as tithes, sustaining their spiritual lifeline across the sea. Faith also transformed daily life. Pagan feasts were replaced or reinterpreted through Christian holidays. Children were baptized, marriages blessed, and the dead laid to rest in consecrated ground. Even on this remote frontier, settlers longed to be part of something larger, the universal Christian community. They wanted to know their souls were joined to those in Norway, Iceland, and beyond, yet traces of the old ways never vanished entirely. Archaeologists have found amulets shaped like Thor's hammer lying beside Christian crosses, suggesting that many Greenlanders hedged their bets. They carried both symbols into the uncertain future, unwilling to abandon any power that might protect them. In such a perilous land, it made sense to invoke every possible blessing. Old and new alike, that faith gave the settlers something beyond the struggle for food and shelter. It gave meaning. To bow their heads in prayer inside turf churches while the Arctic wind screamed outside was to insist that their lives were not random hardship, but part of a divine order. Their faith could not melt the ice or soften the soil, but it gave them the courage to face both. Though Greenland felt like the edge of the world, the Norse who lived there were never entirely cut off. From the beginning, survival depended on ties with Iceland and Norway. The settlers could produce wool, dairy, and hides, but they lacked many essentials: iron for tools, timber for building, grain for bread, and the luxury goods that symbolized status and connection. To bridge these gaps, they turned to trade, forging lifelines across the storm-tossed North Atlantic. Walrus ivory became Greenland's most precious export. Carved and polished, the tusks found their way into Europe, transformed into chess pieces, religious relics, and ornaments for the wealthy. Hunting walrus was no simple task. It required long expeditions north into icy seas, where hunters braved polar bears, shifting ice, and bitter cold. Yet the rewards were great. Ivory fetched high prices and, for a time, kept Greenland relevant in the markets of medieval Europe. Alongside ivory went furs, sealskins, and rope made from walrus hide, all valuable commodities that tied the colony to the wider Norse economy. In exchange, ships brought grain, iron, wood, and church goods. Priests and bishops crossed the sea, ensuring not just trade, but spiritual continuity with the church in Norway. Through them, Greenlanders received letters, relics, and the news of distant events. Kings crowned, crusades launched, wars fought far beyond the horizon. Each ship that appeared in the fjords was both a relief and a reminder. They were not forgotten, but they were far away. And always isolation loomed. Years could pass without a single ship. Storms, political upheavals, or simple neglect could silence Greenland's fragile link to the outside world. During those long gaps, settlers had to rely entirely on themselves. Supplies dwindled. Tools broke and were repaired with bone or stone. Every scrap of iron was precious. They learned to improvise and endure. The psychological toll was immense. Every summer, families stood at the water's edge, scanning the horizon for sails, hoping, praying, waiting. Despite hardship, the Greenlanders remained proud members of the Norse world. They told tales of Leif Erikson sailing further west, toward lands rich in forests and game. They sent gifts to kings and bishops, asserting that they were still part of the great northern tapestry. But beneath that pride lay a fragile truth. Their survival depended on ships. That might never come. Greenland was connected to the wider world, yet always precariously so. Between trade and isolation, belonging and abandonment, faith and fear, its settlers walked a narrow line. Each ship that reached their shores brought hope, and each long silence despair. Still, they endured. Through old and new faith alike, they found meaning in hardship and strength in survival. Their turf churches and silent graves still whisper of endurance, of people who, at the edge of the world, refused to yield, seeing in each prayer a quiet defiance against the endless cold and dark. For centuries, the Norse of Greenland endured, carving out a fragile existence amid ice and stone, sustained by faith, determination, and memories of gentler homelands across the sea. Yet by the 14th and 15th centuries, that endurance began to fade. Archaeology and sagas reveal no single moment of collapse, but rather a slow, relentless decline, a fading instead of a fall. The Little Ice Age gripped the North Atlantic, bringing colder winters and shorter summers. Pastures shrank, harvests failed, and livestock starved. Farming, already a struggle, became nearly impossible. Families slaughtered their animals early, rationed what they could, and faced the long, dark winters with dwindling stores. The bones of children unearthed from late burials show the unmistakable marks of hunger. Trade, once the settlers' lifeline, also failed them. Greenland's prized walrus ivory, long exchanged for Europe's iron, timber, and grain, lost its worth as African elephant ivory took its place. Ships that once linked Greenland to the wider world stopped coming. Deprived of vital imports, the Norse repaired tools with bone, patched roofs with driftwood, and returned to stone where iron had once been. Isolation, once a hardship, became their undoing. Climate and commerce were not the Norse settlers' only foes. Contact with the Inuit, whom they called Skrælings, brought both trade and tension. The Inuit, masters of sea and ice, adapted easily where the Norse, tied to European ways, could not. As the climate worsened and food grew scarce, competition for seals and fishing grounds deepened. Yet even in hardship, the Norse clung to faith. Their turf churches still stood, and priests still held mass before dwindling congregations. One of the last records tells of a wedding feast in the early 15th century, laughter and song echoing briefly amid decline. Soon after came silence. Greenland's Norse were gone, leaving only ruins and graves as witnesses to faith's endurance at the world's edge. By the mid-15th century, no ships returned from Europe, and none set sail from Greenland's fjords. The colony slipped quietly out of history. When later explorers rediscovered the ruins, they found haunting remnants, turf walls still standing, gravestones etched with names long forgotten, and churches whose empty doorways faced the sea. These remains told a story not of failure, but of endurance carried to its final limit. The Norse of Greenland had not fallen for lack of courage. They endured as long as humanly possible, until the ice, the hunger, and the silence claimed them far from Greenland's frozen coasts, in the fertile valleys and windswept highlands of another world. The Irians built their strength not on isolation, but on connection. For them, survival depended not on trade across oceans, but on the intricate web of blood and alliance that bound their clans together. Among the Irians, marriage was never simply the joining of two hearts. It was the binding of bloodlines, the cementing of clan ties, and often the key to peace. In their world, kinship determined honor, protection, and survival. Marriage was therefore a political and social contract first, and a private union second. Every man and woman belonged to an extended network of kin that stretched across valleys and hilltops, controlling land, resources, and warriors. When two people married, the consequences rippled through entire communities, reshaping alliances, ending feuds, or securing military aid. The personal was always political. Marriages were arranged by elders, men of influence who weighed each match like a trade negotiation. They considered wealth, lineage, and reputation, along with the long-term advantages to the clan. A marriage was rarely spontaneous. It was a careful decision, a move in the chess game of survival. Yet, despite this practicality, weddings carried deep symbolic weight. Ceremonies were grand affairs, full of songs, rituals, and feasting. The joining of two families was celebrated as a triumph for the community, a renewal of strength and unity. Each wedding reminded the people that their fates were bound together, that the prosperity of one family depended on the bonds between all. In this way, marriage became the living thread that wove Irian society into a single, resilient fabric for the individuals involved. However, these unions could be both blessing and burden. A bride might be promised to a man she barely knew, her duty bound to her father's promises. A groom might marry not for affection, but for alliance. Yet over time, shared work, shared children, and shared hardship often transformed these unions into genuine partnerships. Within the framework of obligation, love sometimes found room to grow. To marry in Irian society was to step into the web of collective destiny. The ceremony might join two lives, but its impact reached across generations. Elders, fathers, uncles, and respected leaders acted as architects of these unions, their eyes fixed not on passion, but on prosperity and peace. They measured lineage, balanced wealth, and remembered past feuds. A single marriage could end years of conflict or elevate a family's standing for decades to come. For warrior clans, a union could mean military support in future battles. For merchant families, it could open trade routes and secure vital partnerships. Every marriage was a step toward stability, or a gamble with the clan's future. Young men and women rarely had a voice in these choices, especially daughters, whose unions carried the weight of their family's ambitions. Yet within this system of duty and calculation, human emotion still found its place. Bonds of trust, affection, and shared purpose often grew where strategy had first dictated union. The Irians understood that survival required cooperation as much as strength, and marriage was their most enduring form of alliance. Where the Norse of Greenland were undone by isolation, the Irians thrived through connection. Both peoples lived close to the edge of endurance, yet their fates diverged. The Norse looked outward to distant trade and divine providence until the world turned away. The Irians looked inward to the strength of kinship and built a legacy that endured through generations. Both remind us that no civilization survives by courage alone. It endures through bonds of faith, of blood, of shared will that tie people together even as the world around them begins to fade. An Irian bride could be promised to a man she scarcely knew, sometimes long before she reached adulthood. Grooms, too, were bound by the choices of their elders. Personal affection yielded to duty, strategy, and the needs of the clan. Yet arranged marriages were far from loveless constraints. They were the foundation of order and endurance. In a world beset by rival clans, foreign raiders, and unforgiving winters, these unions forged strength through unity. Each marriage bound two kin networks together, merging resources, warriors, and reputations. A young couple entered marriage supported by the wealth and protection of both families, their farms better supplied, their households more secure, and their disputes tempered by the wisdom of elders. Negotiations were conducted publicly, witnessed by the community to ensure fairness and legitimacy. When an agreement was reached, feasts and ceremonies followed, filled with music, toasts, and blessings. These gatherings celebrated more than love. They sanctified alliance. Among the Irians, marriage was not merely a personal union, but a covenant, a visible act of faith in collective survival, ensuring that the strength of one family became the strength of many. Arranged marriages were not seen as limitations of freedom, but as instruments of continuity. The Irians believed that personal happiness could only exist within the harmony of the clan. To marry was to step into a larger story, one written long before the couple was born, one that would outlive them. The joining of hands symbolized not just affection, but shared destiny. At the heart of this institution lay the dowry, an essential part of Irian marital custom. The dowry was far more than a gift from the bride's family. It was a declaration of honor, stability, and faith in the alliance being forged. It demonstrated the bride's family's wealth, generosity, and social standing. Livestock, sheep, goats, or sometimes a prized horse, formed the core of most dowries. They represented living wealth, food, trade, and the promise of growth. Alongside animals came woven textiles, tools, and jewelry, practical resources that would establish the young couple's new household. A generous dowry elevated the family's prestige, while a meager one could provoke gossip and damage reputation. The act of giving was therefore both economic and symbolic. It affirmed that the bride left her family not as a burden, but as a bearer of wealth and honor. The groom's family, meanwhile, did not merely receive, they accepted responsibility. To take a dowry was to make a vow, to protect the bride, to uphold the alliance, and to maintain the trust placed in them. In some Irian regions, the dowry system was balanced by a bride price, gifts flowing in the opposite direction from the groom's kin to the bride's family. This exchange reinforced that marriage was not a purchase but a partnership. Both families invested in the union, binding themselves through tangible goods and moral obligation. The dual exchange of wealth symbolized reciprocity, respect, and the interdependence that underpinned Irian life. Dowry ceremonies were among the most festive events in Irian culture. Villagers gathered to witness the exchange, ensuring transparency and collective memory of the promises made. Feasts followed, tables laden with roasted meats, ale, and bread. Music filled the air, accompanied by ritual blessings invoking prosperity and fertility. The dowry's public nature transformed marriage from a private commitment into a communal vow. Everyone present became a witness and guardian of the bond. Beyond material wealth, the dowry carried deep spiritual significance. It marked the bride's transition between two lineages, smoothing her passage from daughter to wife. In Aryan belief, the exchange of gifts balanced the flow of energies between families. Old ties were honored, and new ones established. The items given, especially those linked to fertility or craftsmanship, were thought to carry ancestral blessings. The bride's woven garments, for example, symbolized her skill and the fertility of her hands, a promise that she would nurture her new household as she once spun and stitched for her old one. For the Aryans, marriage was not only a social contract, but a sacred covenant linking mortals to the divine. At its heart were fertility rites, invoking blessings for children, thriving herds, and fertile land, for without new life, the clan's strength would fade. Before the wedding feast, offerings were made to gods of prosperity, sheep, goats, or bulls sacrificed to secure favor. The blood of these offerings was sometimes sprinkled around the site, sanctifying it as a circle of life and renewal. In certain rites, the bride and groom were anointed with oil or blood, symbolizing their passage from individuals into a united vessel of lineage. Bound by divine will and destiny, fire, too, was sacred to the Aryans, a symbol of purity, renewal, and divine witness. Couples often walked around a fire or leapt through its flames, leaving behind their past lives to begin anew. Some shared food cooked on the sacrificial hearth, binding their fates to the same smoke that rose to the gods. The bride stood at the center of these rites, radiant in fine garments and glittering jewelry, the living emblem of fertility and continuity. Surrounded by women of her kin, she was blessed with chants and dances that called upon the ancestors. Herbs and flowers woven into her hair carried prayers for love, health, and fruitful life. In her, the Aryans saw the bridge between generations, the promise of their clan's enduring future. The groom, on the other hand, was tested as protector and provider. He was expected to prove his worth through feats of strength, offerings to the gods, or symbolic gestures of readiness, such as presenting his sword to the bride's father as a pledge of loyalty. Only once both bride and groom had fulfilled their ritual roles could the marriage be sealed back to the Aryans. Marriage was far more than companionship. It was the binding of worlds, human and divine, past and future. It wove together families, lands, and spirits into a single tapestry of destiny. Through it, the Aryans reaffirmed what they valued most: continuity, unity, and the unbroken chain of life that stretched from their ancestors into the generations yet to come. In Aryan society, marriage was far more than a private bond between two people. It was a sacred covenant uniting families, clans, and gods. The rituals surrounding a wedding reflected the deep spiritual, social, and economic importance of this union. Each gesture, from the exchange of gifts to the spilling of blood, carried the weight of ancestral tradition. Before a marriage could take place, the groom often had to prove his worth. In some traditions, he took part in ritual hunts or contests of strength, demonstrating his ability to provide and protect. Such trials linked masculinity to fertility. A strong hunter meant a strong lineage, capable of feeding and defending future generations. These acts, though competitive, were sacred, for they showed that the man was ready to shoulder the responsibilities of husbandhood and leadership within his clan. Yet the heart of the ceremony extended beyond strength and negotiation. Marriage rites were infused with spiritual significance. To marry was to invite divine forces to bless the union, to renew the clan's strength, and to ensure the continuation of life through children, herds, and harvests. When the formal agreements were completed and dowries exchanged, The solemn proceedings gave way to joyous celebration. Music and dance turned duty into celebration. For the Eryans, weddings were not just joyful gatherings, but affirmations of kinship and survival. Flutes, horns, and lyres wove melodies, while drums and rattles carried the beat. Bards sang of ancestors, heroes, and divine favor, praising the bride's beauty and the groom's strength. Through song and rhythm, the people renewed their bonds, linking present joy to the enduring spirit of their forebears and descendants alike. Dancing held equal importance. Men and women joined hands in circular movements, following the beat of the drums. The circle symbolized unity, eternity, and the endless cycles of birth and death. Some dances were slow and solemn, reflecting reverence for the gods and the sanctity of the covenant. Others were wild and energetic, bursting with vitality, a celebration of fertility and the vigor of new life. Young people showed agility and endurance through competitive dances, while elders moved with calm dignity, embodying the wisdom that sustained the clan. Feasting followed the music and dance. By Aryan standards, wedding feasts were grand affairs. Roasted meat from sacrificial animals was shared among all, with the choicest cuts reserved for the bride, groom, and senior elders. Wine, mead, and fermented brews flowed freely, loosening tongues and fueling laughter. To eat together was not simply to celebrate. It was to renew bonds of trust and solidarity. Each shared meal signified that the whole community stood behind the new household. Sometimes, the festivities lasted for days, drawing in neighboring clans and travelers. These gatherings offered opportunities to settle disputes, form new alliances, and reaffirm old friendships. In laughter, song, and shared food, rivalries softened. The marriage of two individuals became the marriage of families, of lineages, and of the entire people. Through such gatherings, the Aryans declared that every union was a triumph over hardship, a collective affirmation that life endured, but joy was never separate from reverence. For the Aryans, divine blessing was essential, and in their world, blessings came at a cost. Animal sacrifices stood at the center of the wedding ritual, offerings to the gods to ensure fertility, prosperity, and protection. The type of animal sacrificed reflected the family's wealth and status. A powerful clan might offer a bull or a horse, creatures sacred to strength and vitality. Modest families might offer sheep, goats, or pigs, still potent symbols of fertility and abundance. Regardless of the animal chosen, the meaning was the same. A life was given to secure the future of the couple and their kin. The ceremony was performed publicly before the gathered community. Priests or elders with ritual authority oversaw the sacrifice. The chosen animal was adorned with garlands or painted with sacred symbols, then led to an altar or standing stone. With prayers to the gods of fertility, sky, and earth, its blood was spilled onto the soil, a gift of life to ensure life. The earth, in drinking the blood, was believed to return fertility and prosperity in kind. Parts of the animal were burned upon the fire, sending fragrant smoke heavenward as a message to the gods. The remainder became part of the communal feast, binding sacred ritual with human celebration. To share the sacrificial meat was to share in the divine covenant, to become participants in the blessing itself. The act also offered protection. Blood spilled in sacrifice was thought to drive away misfortune and evil spirits, cleansing the union of ill omens and safeguarding the couple's new home. Through these rituals, the Aryans bridged the mortal and divine worlds. Marriage was not just a contract of land and wealth, but a renewal of cosmic order, a reaffirmation that human life, clan prosperity, and divine favor were intertwined. At the heart of it all stood the bride, radiant, adorned, and sacred. She was more than a participant. She was the embodiment of continuity, carrying the hopes of generations. While men arranged the alliances and performed the sacrifices, it was the women who prepared the bride. Preserving traditions handed down through countless mothers before them, in the days leading up to the wedding, female relatives bathed and anointed her, combed her hair, and dressed her in her finest garments. Necklaces of bronze, silver, or colored glass beads glimmered at her throat, reflecting her family's wealth and artistry. Her belt and brooches fastened garments woven by her own hands, proof of her skill and diligence. Some items were treasured heirlooms, linking her to ancestors whose blessings she now carried into her new life. This preparation was more than adornment. Each gesture symbolized purification, transformation, and continuity. As she stepped into marriage, the bride became the vessel of her people's future, the living bridge between the past that had endured and the generations yet to come. Through song, sacrifice, and sacred fire, Aryan marriage was both a personal vow and a communal promise. It bound hearts and bloodlines, families and gods in a single, enduring covenant, one that declared, "This union is not just for two, but for us all." For the Aryans, the transformation from maiden to wife was one of the most sacred passages in a woman's life. The rituals surrounding the bride's departure from her family marked not just a change in status, but a crossing between worlds, from daughter to matron, from one lineage to another. In many traditions, the bride was veiled, symbolizing both modesty and the mystery of her new role. Her female kin sang laments, bittersweet songs, mourning her separation from her birth home, while blessing her path ahead. These songs embodied the dual nature of Aryan marriage, both loss and renewal, sorrow and hope intertwined in one sacred transition. The journey to the groom's household was itself a public rite of passage. The bride, often riding on horseback or walking at the center of a solemn procession, was escorted by her relatives through the heart of the community. Along the way, neighbors offered her food, drink, or charms to ward off misfortune. This act of witnessing transformed her journey into a communal event. She ceased to be merely a daughter leaving home. Before all eyes, she became a wife, bound to a new family and a new destiny. When the bride arrived at the groom's dwelling, a series of solemn rites awaited her. She might circle the hearth 3 times, honoring it as the heart of her new household, a sacred fire that symbolized warmth, life, and divine favor. Through this ritual, she bound herself to the eternal flame of family continuity. Bread, milk, or honey were sometimes offered to her as omens of fertility and prosperity. In some traditions, she was given the honor of kindling a new fire. Carrying the spiritual essence of her birth home into the house, she would now rule. Though her marriage was often arranged and her voice limited in the negotiations, the bride stood at the center of Aryan ritual life. She embodied fertility, renewal, and hope, the living bridge between clans, entrusted with carrying forward the lifeblood of her people. Through her, the sacred cycle of ancestry and inheritance was renewed. For the Aryans, marriage reached far beyond personal affection. It was a covenant between families, a political alliance that ensured strength and stability in an uncertain world. Among rival clans, a union could end years of hostility, transforming former enemies into kin. Once bloodlines intertwined through children, vengeance lost its meaning, for to harm one's foe was to harm one's own flesh. Thus, the wedding feast became more than a celebration. It was a sacred peace pact, sealed with ritual, music, and divine blessing. Other unions were born of ambition rather than reconciliation. Powerful clans sought marriages with families of influence, wealthy landholders, skilled warriors, or those with access to trade routes and resources. Such unions elevated status and secured prosperity. The exchange of dowries and bride prices was not mere tradition, but a declaration of intent, a sign of strength and stability. The greater the exchange, the more enduring the bond was believed to be. These alliances carried profound obligations. In times of famine, a husband might turn to his wife's kin for aid. In war, her family was bound to send warriors or provisions. Conversely, the wife retained the right to appeal to her birth clan if mistreated, ensuring accountability within marriage. This balance of reciprocal duty maintained both justice and cohesion among Aryan tribes. Through these ties, a single marriage could influence politics, shape alliances, and ripple across entire regions. Marriage also reflected the Aryans' rigid social hierarchy. The grandest unions, marked by extravagant feasts, animal sacrifices, and ornate dowries, belonged to the ruling clans. Lesser families mirrored these customs on a smaller scale, weaving themselves into the broader structure of Aryan society. In this way, each wedding acted as a map of social order, publicly displaying who held power and who sought to climb higher. The communal nature of Aryan weddings reinforced this structure. When clans gathered to witness the vows, they reaffirmed not only the marriage, but their shared identity. Guests feasted, sang, and danced as part of the sacred covenant, becoming participants rather than mere spectators. Through celebration, they renewed their collective strength, each song, each toast, each dance step binding them to the fate of the new couple and, by extension, to the destiny of their people. Marriage, for the Aryans, was the glue of society. It healed rivalries, forged alliances, and maintained the delicate equilibrium of a world forever threatened by conflict and scarcity. Two individuals might stand at the center of the ceremony, but the true bond was between entire bloodlines, a covenant of survival written not in words, but in ritual, sacrifice, and the continuity of life itself. Though the Aryans eventually disappeared into history, absorbed first by Roman expansion and later by the tide of new cultures, the essence of their marriage customs endured. The belief that marriage united not only hearts, but lineages survived in the Balkan highlands for centuries. Medieval and early modern villagers still arranged unions for political and familial advantage, echoing Aryan ideals of alliance and mutual protection. Even as Christianity replaced the old gods, Aryan fertility rites left their mark. The sacrifice of animals gave way to blessings of bread and wine. The sacred hearth fire became the candle of Christ. Yet beneath these new symbols lay the same ancient belief that prosperity, fertility, and harmony depended on divine favor and communal unity. Circle dances, still performed at weddings across the Balkans, retain the Aryan symbolism of continuity and togetherness. The improvised songs that praise the bride and groom continue an oral tradition thousands of years old, transforming private unions into shared celebrations. And in the watchful eyes of elders who still guide or bless the marriages of the young, one can glimpse the enduring echo of the Aryan conviction that love, though precious, must serve the greater strength of the clan. In the end, Aryan marriage traditions reflected a people who saw survival in unity between lovers, families, clans, and gods. Though their tribe vanished, their spirit endures through rituals, songs, and the timeless human need for connection, a flame still burning across generations and ages. Harald Sigurdsson, later remembered as Harald Hardrada, the Hard ruler, was born in 1015 amid one of Norway's most unsettled eras. The kingdom was fractured, with rival chieftains, petty kings, and foreign powers vying for control across Scandinavia. The Viking spirit of bravery and raiding still thrived. Even as Christianity began to change the cultural landscape, that Harald was born into the noble house of Sigurd Syr, a minor but respected king of Ringerike, inheriting both status and expectation. His mother, Chita Gudbrandsdatter, was politically shrewd and strong-willed, making him half-brother to Olaf Haraldsson, the future King Olaf II and Saint Olaf. From the moment of his birth, Harald's life was intertwined with royal ambition, dynastic intrigue, and the shifting tides of loyalty and power, shaping a destiny marked by warfare, exile, and eventual conquest. Norway in Harald's youth was a land of unrest, a patchwork of rival chieftains and shifting loyalties, with Denmark and England casting long shadows over the North Sea. Alliances were fragile. A friend one season could be an enemy the next. In this turbulent world, Harald grew up straddling two eras, the age of Norse raiders and sagas, and the new Christian order spreading under his half-brother, Olaf. His upbringing blended martial and spiritual teachings. By day, he heard tales of Odin, Thor, and the gods of his ancestors whose guidance had carried Norsemen across stormy seas. By night, priests and monks spoke of Christ, salvation, and divine mercy, though their words often competed with the clang of weapons being forged. This duality of faith and ferocity molded Harald into a man of iron and conviction, a bridge between old and new worlds. Even as a youth, Harald stood apart. Sagas describe him as towering, perhaps over 6 feet, with piercing eyes and a commanding presence that drew loyalty and fear alike. Bold and restless, he mastered swordplay, horsemanship, hunting, and tactics, excelling at every test of strength and courage. Those around him sensed he was destined for more than his father's lands, a life shaped by war, ambition, and a far-reaching destiny. Harald's half-brother, Olaf, was already a legend in the making, a warrior king determined to unite Norway under a single crown and under the banner of Christianity. Olaf became both Harald's mentor and protector, but also the man who would shape his life's path. For Harald, growing up in a royal household meant living in constant danger. Power in 11th century Norway was fragile. Betrayal lurked behind smiles, and daggers waited in the dark. Yet it was in this crucible that Harald's unbreakable resolve was forged. He was not born to inherit, he was born to earn. As the youngest son, he had little claim to power or land. But fate had greater ambitions for him. By the summer of 1030, Harald was only 15 years old. Yet he found himself marching into one of the defining battles in Norway's history, the Battle of Stiklestad. His brother Olaf, recently deposed by a coalition of Norwegian nobles, allied with the mighty King Canute the Great of Denmark, sought to reclaim his throne. Determined and desperate, Olaf rallied his loyalists and began his march toward home. Among his warriors was the young Harald, burning with the desire to prove his valor. The armies clashed in a rural valley that would echo through legend. On one side stood Olaf's faithful men, warriors drawn from small clans still loyal to the fallen king. On the other stood an overwhelming host of rebels, backed by Danish power and greed. The air was thick with the sound of steel, the cries of the dying, and the thunder of shields. Amid the chaos, Harald fought beside Olaf in the shield wall, his youth forgotten in the fury of combat. He fought with the ferocity of 10 men, his sword rising and falling amid the sea of enemies. But the battle was hopelessly lost. Olaf fell, struck down by his own countrymen. His death later sanctified as martyrdom for Norway's conversion to Christianity. Harald, bloodied and broken, fought until he too fell beneath his enemies' blows. Yet unlike his brother, he lived. His survival, though miraculous, condemned him to exile. With Olaf dead and the rebellion triumphant, Harald could no longer remain in Norway. If captured, he would face certain death. Gathering a handful of loyal warriors, he fled eastward, leaving behind his homeland, his family, and his youth on the fields of Stiklestad. Harald's exile carried him through forests and icy rivers into Sweden, and from there to the bustling city of Kiev, ruled by Prince Yaroslav the Wise. The city was a crossroads of cultures, where Norsemen, Slavs, Greeks, and traders from distant lands mingled. Harald offered his sword to Yaroslav and quickly earned a place among the prince's elite warriors. His courage and leadership distinguished him, and his band of exiled Norsemen became trusted allies in Yaroslav's campaigns. Yet Harald's ambition reached farther, south to Byzantium, the richest empire of the age. Traveling down the great eastern rivers, Harald reached Constantinople, known to the Norse as Miklagard. There he joined the Varangian Guard, the emperor's elite corps of foreign warriors, famed for loyalty and ferocity. Harald's height, skill, and resolve made him stand out even among seasoned soldiers. Over nearly a decade, he fought across Sicily, Asia Minor, and the Mediterranean, clashing with Arabs and enemies of the empire. The sagas portray him as both soldier and strategist, mastering the subtleties of command, the art of war, and the accumulation of wealth. By the time his service ended, Harald had gained immense riches, renown, and a hard-won wisdom no battlefield in Norway could have given him. He learned that survival depended not only on strength, but also on patience, cunning, and alliances. When he finally looked north again, he was no longer the boy who had fled Stiklestad wounded. He was a man forged in war and empire, ready to reclaim the throne denied to him in youth. In exile, Harald Hardrada transformed from a fugitive into a formidable warrior and leader. The boy who left Norway in defeat would return as its king, the last great Viking, tempered by blood, battle, and the far reaches of the known world. Harald Hardrada's years in exile had transformed him from a wounded boy into a seasoned warrior, commander, and strategist. During his service in the Byzantine Empire, he fought across the Mediterranean, in Sicily against Arab forces, and along the empire's eastern borders against Bulgars and other enemies. Some accounts even place him in the Holy Land, guarding pilgrims and asserting imperial authority. His exploits earned him wealth, renown, and scars that would mark him as a figure of legend. The Varangian Guard, composed primarily of Norse warriors, became both his school and his family, forging bonds of loyalty and trust in the crucible of constant warfare. Harald's service brought not only fame but immense riches. Gold, silks, jewels, and plunder flowed into his coffers, carefully stored in Kiev under the protection of Prince Yaroslav the Wise, ensuring that he would have the resources needed to reclaim Norway. Reputation, however, was as important as wealth. He was no longer the boy who had fled Stiklestad. He was a commander whose name inspired respect across Byzantium and beyond. Tales of 80 battles, whether fully accurate or embellished, painted him as a relentless fighter and a cunning leader, earning him the nickname the Hard Ruler for his unyielding determination. Harald's years in Constantinople refined his understanding of leadership, strategy, and politics. He learned the subtle art of negotiation, the importance of loyalty, and the power of patience. Yet he remained restless, always seeking the next challenge, always planning for the return to his homeland. By 1042, he had grown into a man of wealth, experience, and ambition, ready to transform exile into opportunity. Upon leaving Byzantium, Harald retrieved his treasures from Kiev and secured his marriage to Elisive, Yaroslav's daughter, cementing a political alliance with one of the most influential courts in Eastern Europe. With wealth, marriage, and loyal followers, Harald sailed north, ready to reclaim his birthright in Norway. The kingdom, meanwhile, was under King Magnus the Good, son of Harald's half-brother, Saint Olaf. Magnus was competent and respected, yet Harald's bloodline and newfound power could not be ignored. Harald's return was strategic rather than reckless. Leveraging his alliances and immense resources, he pressed his claim as Olaf's surviving brother. Rather than immediately waging civil war, he reached a compromise with Magnus. The two would rule Norway as co-kings. The arrangement was fraught with tension. Harald's experience and ambition clashing with Magnus' authority. Yet it allowed Harald to re-establish himself in his homeland without plunging it into chaos. When Magnus died in 1047, Harald became the sole ruler of Norway, fulfilling the long-sought goal that had haunted him since the disaster at Stiklestad. His ambitions, however, extended beyond domestic rule. Harald aimed to revive the Viking legacy of dominion across the North Sea, looking toward Denmark, England, and other territories once bound by Norse power. He sought not merely to inherit a crown, but to build an empire reminiscent of the great Viking kings of old. His primary adversary in Denmark was King Svein Estridsson, a resilient and cunning ruler who had survived previous Norwegian campaigns. For nearly 20 years, Harald engaged in continuous conflict with Svein, raiding Danish coasts, burning villages, seizing livestock, and undermining the king's support. Harald's naval prowess and tactical ingenuity allowed him to strike decisively. Yet Denmark proved a persistent and formidable opponent. These campaigns demonstrated Harald's unrelenting ambition and strategic mind, blending the ferocity of the Viking warrior with the cunning of a seasoned commander. Harald's rule over Norway was characterized by both consolidation and expansion. He strengthened royal authority, secured trade routes, and reinforced alliances with neighboring states, while also projecting power outward through raids and military campaigns. His experiences in exile, commanding elite troops, navigating Byzantine politics, and amassing wealth, equipped him to enforce his vision of a unified, strong Norway capable of projecting influence across Scandinavia, by combining battlefield skill with diplomatic acumen. Harald reshaped the political landscape of Northern Europe. His campaigns in Denmark were part of a broader strategy to recreate a North Sea empire that echoed the ambitions of his Viking predecessors. Each raid, each negotiation, each display of power was a calculated step toward dominance. He understood that kingship required more than inheritance. It demanded authority, resources, and the fear and respect of allies and enemies alike. Harald's ambition extended to England, a land long shaped by Norse incursions and Viking legacy. Though previous English kings had resisted conquest, Harald believed that with careful strategy, wealth, and seasoned warriors, he could assert dominance. His campaigns there would become pivotal, marking the final chapters of the Viking era. Drawing on decades of military experience and hard-won skill, Harald aimed to transform his reputation as a warrior and ruler into lasting political power, extending his influence far beyond Norway's shores. Throughout his campaigns, Harald Hardrada displayed an extraordinary blend of military skill and strategic insight. Whether commanding fleets along hostile coastlines or negotiating with foreign rulers, he understood that every decision impacted not only Norway's future, but also his personal ambitions. His experiences in Byzantium, Sicily, and Eastern Europe honed his ability to combine courage with cunning, enabling him to act decisively in battle while navigating the complexities of diplomacy. Harald's fearlessness, discipline, and calculated ambition allowed him to consolidate power at home and project influence abroad. In doing so, he became one of the most formidable rulers of his time, leaving a legacy that endured in both history and legend. Harald Hardrada's return to Norway marked the end of years of exile, warfare, and ambition. From fleeing Stiklestad as a boy to serving as a seasoned Byzantine commander, he became a ruler capable of asserting authority, inspiring loyalty, and shaping history. Under Harald, Norway became a base for wider ambitions, restoring Viking influence over the North Sea, challenging Denmark, and preparing campaigns toward England. His life combined military skill, political strategy, and unyielding ambition, securing his legacy as the last great Viking, pursuing both glory and empire across the medieval North. Harald Hardrada, famously called the Hard Ruler, earned his reputation through relentless discipline and unwavering ambition. His campaigns against Denmark showcased his military expertise, yet King Svein Estridsson remained undefeated. Years of battles and raids strained Norway's resources, and Harald struggled to achieve true political control. By 1064, both rulers, worn down by prolonged conflict, agreed to a truce, leaving Harald frustrated. Despite his unfulfilled dream of uniting Norway and Denmark, his ambition endured. Turning his attention across the North Sea toward England, the English throne, long connected to Norwegian claims, became Harald's next target. Decades earlier, King Canute the Great had ruled Norway, Denmark, and England, creating a vast North Sea empire. After Canute's death, the realm fragmented, but Harald believed inheritance rights, through Magnus the Good, gave him a legitimate claim. When Edward the Confessor died without an heir, Harald Godwinson seized the crown. Harald saw his opportunity, forming an alliance with his estranged brother-in-law. Tostig Godwinson, he prepared a decisive invasion, aiming to restore Viking dominance in England and establish a northern empire, capable of rivaling any kingdom in Scandinavia. Harald Hardrada prepared his invasion of England with meticulous care, assembling a massive fleet, reportedly nearly 300 ships, carrying thousands of veteran warriors. Many had fought alongside him in Norway, Denmark, and the Mediterranean, seasoned by decades of battle and driven by the promise of plunder and glory. The fleet crossed the North Sea swiftly, propelled by Harald's determination to claim the English crown and expand his northern empire. Landing in northern England, Harald moved decisively toward York, the key stronghold of the region. On September 20th, at Fulford, he faced the army of northern earls, Edwin of Mercia and Mercar of Northumbria. Harald's disciplined formations and decades of experience in coordinated Viking warfare allowed his troops to rout the northern forces. Victory at Fulford showcased both his tactical brilliance and the efficiency of his seasoned warriors. Temporarily securing the north and placing York within his grasp, however, Harald's triumph was only the first step. The true challenge remained in confronting Harald Godwinson, the newly crowned king. Known for his speed and strategic acumen, Godwinson quickly marched north from London, covering vast distances in days. Harald, emboldened by initial successes, now faced a formidable and determined opponent, prepared to challenge his claim and defend the English throne. The confrontation that followed would test Harald's lifetime of experience. The armies met near York, and Harald's forces held a strong position, well organized and disciplined. His seasoned warriors and the veterans of Scandinavian and Mediterranean campaigns formed an impressive shield wall, demonstrating the tactical principles he had honed over decades. Yet Harald Godwinson's arrival forced the Norwegian king to confront not only military opposition, but also the challenges of terrain, communication, and the limited time available to secure his foothold in hostile territory. Despite immense pressure, Harald displayed his trademark ruthlessness and strategic brilliance. His army's discipline and cohesion inflicted heavy losses on English forces, yet even his skill had limits. Though northern England fell and key victories were won, Harald Godwinson's rapid mobilization threatened to undo his gains. Success required more than brute force. It demanded speed, logistics, and adaptability. Harald leveraged naval superiority to move troops, block reinforcements, and secure supply lines, while his land forces combined disciplined formations with fierce aggression. Each battle tested his veterans' endurance, but loyalty to Harald and the promise of reward kept them steadfast. Drawing on lessons from campaigns in Norway, Denmark, and Byzantium, he applied experience, tactical acumen, and relentless ferocity to assert dominance, hoping to translate his hard-won reputation into lasting conquest across England. Political factors also influenced the campaign. Harald's alliance with Tostig Godwinson offered a veneer of legitimacy, framing the invasion as a restoration of rights rather than pure conquest. It also provided intelligence, support, and knowledge of English political divisions. However, relying on an exiled brother for local insight carried its own risks. Trust and coordination were essential to prevent misunderstandings or missteps in a foreign land. Harald balanced these variables with characteristic decisiveness, ensuring that his military expertise guided every move while keeping strategic objectives in focus. Harald's ambition in England epitomized his lifelong drive. From the boy who fled Stiklestad to the seasoned commander of the Varangian Guard, he had honed his skills across continents. His invasion of England represented the culmination of decades of preparation, military experience, accumulated wealth, alliances, and the relentless ambition that had propelled him through exile, service, and conquest. For Harald, England was more than a prize. It was the opportunity to revive the Viking legacy, to extend his influence across the North Sea, and to secure his place as the final great figure of the Viking Age. As Harald Hardrada's fleet neared England's northern coast, his lifelong saga reached its pinnacle. Decades of exile, campaigns across Scandinavia and Byzantium, and carefully forged alliances all converged on this decisive moment. Facing local earls and King Harald Godwinson, Harald's experience, ambition, and strategic skill were tested as never before. Every ship, shield, and sword carried the weight of years spent mastering warfare, and through leadership. His invasion represented the culmination of a lifetime dedicated to conquest and the restoration of a North Sea empire. The coming battles in northern England would decide not only Harald's fate, but also mark the closing chapter of the Viking Age, as one of its last great warriors sought to carve glory on foreign soil. Asserting the enduring reach of his ambition, Harald's campaign in England stands as a testament to both his skill and relentless determination. Confronted by experienced defenders and the challenges of foreign politics, he drew on the same principles that had carried him from Norway to Byzantium: ruthless discipline, innovative tactics, and an expansive vision of power. Every maneuver reflected decades of warfare, strategy, and leadership honed across continents. Though the campaign tested the limits of his ambition, it cemented Harald Hardrada's place in history, leaving a lasting legacy as one of the Viking Age's most formidable leaders, whose influence and audacity resonated far beyond his lifetime. Harald Hardrada, Norway's formidable Hard ruler, brought decades of ambition, warfare, and tactical expertise to England's northern shores. His years of campaigns across Scandinavia, Byzantium, and the Mediterranean had shaped him into a seasoned and battle-hardened commander. Arriving with a skilled army and a powerful Viking fleet, Harald swiftly moved to capture York, a strategic northern stronghold. At Fulford, he confronted the forces of Edwin of Mercia and Mercar of Northumbria. Harald's superior discipline, cohesion, and experience ensured a decisive victory, forcing York to surrender. Flush with success, Harald consolidated his hold over the north, taking hostages, securing supplies, and demanding loyalty from the local populace. Confident of his looming conquest, he even dispatched part of his fleet back to Norway. Yet fate intervened abruptly. King Harald Godwinson, preparing to face William of Normandy in the south, marched north at extraordinary speed, covering nearly 200 miles in under a week. His sudden appearance caught Harald completely unprepared, with many of his men scattered, some unarmored or resting, expecting negotiation rather than immediate battle. On September 25, 1066, the two armies clashed at Stamford Bridge. For Harald, this confrontation would be the ultimate test and the final chapter in a lifetime of exile, warfare, and ambition. The Norse warriors faced a fresh, well-armed, and determined English army. Early in the battle, legend recounts a giant Norse warrior who held the bridge against waves of English soldiers until he was slain by a spear thrust through the planks. This heroic act bought Harald precious time, but the odds remained overwhelmingly against him, setting the stage for a decisive and fateful confrontation. Harald, true to his name, the Hard ruler, refused to retreat. Tall, commanding, and unmistakable on the battlefield, he led his warriors with relentless courage, embodying the Viking ideal of leadership through example. But the fates were unyielding. In the chaos of combat, an arrow struck Harald in the throat, silencing the voice of one of history's most relentless warriors. His death shattered Norse morale, and the tide of battle swiftly turned. Thousands of Vikings were slain, and of the great fleet that had crossed the North Sea, only a fraction returned home. Chronicles recount that while over 300 ships had carried Harald's forces to England, barely 24 were needed to bring the survivors back to Norway. Harald, Hardrada's death at Stamford Bridge, was more than the fall of a king. It marked the symbolic end of the Viking Age in Europe. For nearly 3 centuries, Norsemen had raided, traded, and ruled across the continent, leaving enduring marks on kingdoms, cities, and empires. With Harald's defeat, the era of the great Viking adventurers effectively closed. Just weeks later, William of Normandy's victory at Hastings would reshape England, cementing the end of Viking dominance. Yet Harald's memory and the epic he represented would endure in history and legend. The Saga of Harald. Hardrada captures the Viking spirit, relentless ambition, strategic genius, and fearless leadership. A Norwegian prince, mercenary, Byzantium warrior, and king, each stage of his life reflected his restless energy, carrying him from Norway to the far reaches of Europe. Stamford Bridge marked the climax of his lifelong pursuits. Despite careful planning, decades of experience, and the loyalty of seasoned warriors, Harald faced the harsh forces of surprise, fatigue, and fate. Across campaigns in Norway, Denmark, the Mediterranean, and England, he combined discipline with audacity, inspiring men and executing complex operations with precision. Yet, at Stamford Bridge, even his skill could not withstand Harold Godwinson's rapid advance and the exhaustion of his troops. Ending both his life and a defining chapter of Viking expansion in northern Europe. Though defeated, Harald Hardrada's life and legacy remain extraordinary. Bold, restless, and unyielding, he is remembered as the last great Viking, a symbol of exploration, conquest, and ambition. His campaigns, strategies, and courage continued to inspire generations, ensuring that the Viking spirit lived on long after its dominance ended. Harald's story illustrates the complexity of leadership in an era defined by shifting alliances, brutal warfare, and personal ambition. It is a tale of exile turned into opportunity, of battles fought across continents, and of relentless pursuit of power that spanned decades. Even as his life ended on a foreign battlefield, the impact of his campaigns, the fear he inspired, and the legend he left behind cemented his place in history. Stamford Bridge was both an end and a testament. The Viking Age, with its raiders, traders, and kings, had reached its final act. Harald Hardrada's ambitions, skill, and vision had carried him further than almost any other Norseman. Yet the changing political realities of Europe, combined with the speed and determination of his adversaries, proved insurmountable. His death marked the symbolic passing of a cultural era. As England and the continent moved towards centralized kingdoms and emerging medieval states, Harald Hardrada's legacy is measured not only in territorial conquests, but in a life lived at the extremes of ambition and courage. His campaigns shaped Norway's history, influenced the politics of Denmark and England, and left a lasting imprint on European memory. Even in defeat, he was remembered as a formidable warrior, one who had fought from the fjords of Norway to the plains of England, whose leadership and determination defined the final chapter of the Viking era. The Saga of Harald. Hardrada is the story of relentless pursuit of glory. From his youth in exile, through service in Byzantium, to conquest in Norway, and finally his campaign in England, Harald's life embodies the daring and restless spirit of the Vikings. Stamford Bridge marked both the end of his personal journey and the close of the Viking Age. Yet, his name endures as a symbol of ambition, courage, and indomitable will. Harald's life and death are inseparable from the story of the Viking Age. His victories, defeats, and ultimate fall demonstrate both the reach and limits of Viking power. Though the era of raiders ended, his legend, fierce, ambitious, and unyielding, ensured the Viking spirit would remain immortal, a lasting testament to an age defined by exploration, conquest, and audacious adventure.